everybody for coming today. I am a psychiatrist in New York City and Connecticut, and I often treat creatives and artists in every field. And something that often comes up is this idea of how creativity and psychopathology and certain mental disorders are often connected. And so when my friend Maxim asked me to do a talk for his conference today, I thought that this would be a lovely topic that a lot of people would be interested in. And so I'm going to give a little talk speaking about some individuals throughout history for whom madness and creativity were very linked, as well as what the science has found about that very link and why it exists. And then I will open it up to your questions, which I very much welcome. So we will begin now. And Udoku, I'm going to be letting you know, I'll say next slide. We had a little glitch and we found a way to fix it together. So the link between madness and creativity is as old as time. In ancient Greece, we had Aristotle believing that those who have become eminent in philosophy, politics, poetry, and the arts all had tendencies towards melancholia or depression. Plato noted eccentricities of poets and playwrights. Seneca stated that no great genius has ever existed without some touch of madness. And Socrates said that the poet has no invention in him until he's been inspired and out of his senses. This association has followed us into modern times with individuals like Robert Schumann hearing voices to guide his music, Sylvia Plath sticking her head in an oven, and Vincent Van Gogh cutting off his ear. Robin Williams, one of the most amazing comedians and actors of our time, is an example of the connection between creativity and madness. It's well established in the public conscience that some of the most brilliant and creative people in our fields have been plagued by mental illness, some even succumbing to suicide. Robin Williams had a lifetime struggle with depression and addiction. In his earlier life, it was cocaine addiction. In his later life, it was alcohol addiction. In August of 2014, at the age of 63, he committed suicide by hanging himself. An autopsy a few months later revealed that he had Lewy body disease, a type of dementia that could impact your mood, your capacity for movement, your ability to think. And he also had some Parkinsonian symptoms. So that very likely contributed to the suicide. Mozart, a musical prodigy and one of the most influential composers of classical music, started composing at the age of 5, started touring to perform with his father at the age of 6, composed his first symphony at the age of 8. He was so brilliant that he could listen to music and then replay it after only hearing it once. And he also suffered a great deal from many different possible mental illnesses, some of which didn't even have diagnoses at the time. He likely had depression and would fall into deep depressive bouts, but also likely had bipolar 2. Bipolar disorder is manic depression, and it's when you have depressive periods that alternate with manic periods. Bipolar 1 is the very severe form of mania, and that's when over the course of a week, at least that's what the criteria is now, you can have the increased energy, increased productivity, increased grandiosity, despite a decreased need for sleep. You can start to talk faster, be more productive. You can call the president with brilliant ideas. You can have affairs. You can spend lots of money without thinking about it. You can act impulsively. You can take unplanned trips. All of this is part of bipolar 1, the more serious form of bipolar. Bipolar 2 is a more attenuated version of this, where you can have certain aspects of this, but it's not quite as disruptive to your career or to your relationships. And a lot of people who are manic depressive, they actually love what the manic, or in bipolar 2, the hypomanic, kind of a mini mania, what those phases feel like. So they would rather not treat their bipolar at all so they can feel these amazing manic or hypomanic bursts of productivity. And for a lot of artists and authors who've been bipolar, it's during their manic or hypermanic periods that they've achieved so much. Mozart also may have had what is now diagnosed as a mild form of autism or Asperger's, or even Tourette's. He had repeated facial expressions, unintentional constant motion of his hands and feet, and a tendency towards jumping. Furthermore, it's been said that his hearing was so intense and sensitive that loud sounds would often affect him physically, making him sick. These behaviors have been regarded by some as auditory and motor fits or tics, and their presence has been used to support the diagnosis of Tourette's syndrome or Asperger's or a mild form of autism. Mozart also exhibited impolite and frequent mood changes. During one of his improvisations, for instance, he became unexpectedly bored, so he decided to jump up, jump over some tables and chairs, meow like a cat, and begin doing somersaults. Beethoven was one of the most admired composers in the history of Western music. He also, like Mozart, suffered from a variety of psychiatric symptoms, yet different ones. His included persecutory delusions, volatile moods, explosive rages, and suicidal ideation. However, he had an incredible capacity for resilience and coping with adversity. After his deafness, a catastrophe for any musician, he ultimately embraced the loss of his hearing as an opportunity to fill his artistic destiny. Locked in this silent world of his imagination, he created a musical language that was different from anything that had previously existed. He ended up writing sonatas which vastly exceeded the capacity for resonance of the instruments of his era, because his music existed in his mind, where he was able to create fresh and not be limited by physical limitation of hearing. And he wrote works such as his renowned Fifth and Ninth Symphonies, which begin with dramatic conflict and end in triumph and transcendence, paralleling the narrative of his own life story arc. Virginia Woolf was one of the most important modern 12th century authors. She was a pioneer in a type of writing called stream of consciousness, which is a very powerful process for getting at unconscious processes in the course of a narrative. Her first mental breakdown was at the age of 13 after her mother died, and she suffered with bipolar throughout the course of her life. She was institutionalized several times and attempted suicide at least twice. At the age of 59, in 1941, she died by drowning herself in a river. Ernest Hemingway, one of the most brilliant writers of our time, whose works are considered to be classics in American literature, won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. He suffered from severe bipolar illness, alcoholism, and traumatic brain injury. One of his hobbies was boxing, and he often got hit in the head, which likely contributed to traumatic brain injury, which is actually a risk factor and can exacerbate things like addiction and bipolar. He was married 4 times, and many people say that over a certain number of marriages is pathognomonic or pretty much diagnostic of bipolar, because when people are in their manic or hypermanic state, they can feel more in love with the world, in love with themselves. That's when they're more likely to have affairs, get married, feel on top of the world. And then if you go down into depressions and then up into your hypomanic or manic episodes, oftentimes love is something that will be somebody's salvation during the time of depression. They find love, and then that pushes them back into their hypomanic or manic episode. There's been many, many cases described of that. However, despite all of Ernest Hemingway's brilliance, he ended up committing suicide by shooting himself at the age of 61. This is something, suicide, there is a strong hereditary history or family history of that. His father, sister, brother, and then many people after who came after Hemingway also ended up dying by suicide. The 19th century German composer Robert Schumann had bipolar depression and intermittent bouts of psychosis. He spent the last years of his life in an insane asylum, where he eventually died of self-starvation at the age of 46. The psychiatrist at the time prescribed phlebotomy and hydrotherapy as mood stabilizers for his condition. So Schumann is someone who actually demonstrated both the creative advantages and disadvantages of mental illness. During his episodic depressive periods, he would compose virtually nothing because of his difficulty concentrating, and he was seized with this delusional conviction that he was a worthless composer. But then he cycled into these hypomanic states. He was so prolific. He made use of his increased energy, his sharpened imagination, his decreased need for sleep to create original and masterful masterpieces that ended up defining him. The arc of his career reveals episodic bouts of staggering creativity, where he composed 3-string quartets in a 2-week period and completed 140 songs in 1 year. The brilliant 19th century composer Tchaikovsky of the Romantic period also suffered greatly and had chronic dysthymia and was plagued with suicidal thoughts. He resisted instruction from his internist, who told him to work less in order to preserve his energy, because he basically said, I need work like I need air to breathe. As soon as I'm idle, despondency overcomes me. I'm dissatisfied with myself and even hate myself. Only work saves me. Without music, I would go insane. And finally, we have John Nash, a Princeton mathematician and the only person who's ever been awarded both the Nobel Prize of Economics and the prestigious Abel Prize for Mathematics. In contrast to the other people that I presented who suffered primarily from depression or bipolar illness and substance abuse, John Nash suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Now, this is a chronic condition, and often people with this diagnosis are unable to produce and to have as productive a life as John Nash. So he really is an exception. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia at the age of 31. And 11 or 12 years later, his condition slowly improved, allowing him to return to academic work by the mid-1980s. One of his adult sons also developed schizophrenia in his adulthood. And just a few years ago, John Nash and his wife, who he divorced during the time that he was very severely ill and then remarried, after he was coming back to receive the Abel Prize for Mathematics, they unfortunately lost their life in a car accident. And this is not recent, this is in 1915. But he, despite such a serious diagnosis, was able to have a very productive and constructive life. This begs the question, what is this connection between genius and madness? Lombroso, a famous forensic psychiatrist, argued towards the end of the 19th century that genius and madness were closely connected manifestations of an underlying neurodegenerative or degenerative neurologic disorder. So basically, that genius is also a disorder. It's not just madness that's a disorder, but there's something in genius that also could be disordered. So before we go into what the science shows about this connection, let's talk a little bit about the nature of creativity. There is 4 different types of creativity. And creativity can be simply defined as the act of turning new and imaginative ideas into reality. More than 60 definitions exist for creativity, and no single one has uniform acceptance. So we're going to go with this simple one. But there's many different types of ways to be creative. First, there is the deliberate and cognitive creativity. And this is what comes from sustained work, from a work in a discipline. And this is like Thomas Edison, who ran experiment after experiment after experiment until he finally was able to discover the electric light bulb. Then there is a deliberate emotional creativity. And this is when somebody who, because of some emotional work they have done on themselves, or because of an emotional situation like a crisis, a relationship breakup, losing a job, going through bankruptcy, they do some deliberate work on themselves and recognize a solution to an important problem. This can be for their personal life or for their creative life at work. Then there's spontaneous cognitive creativity. And this is a sudden realization based on prior rational analysis, such as when Isaac Newton discovered gravity after an apple fell on his head from a tree. And the final type is what many of our brilliant musicians have, which is spontaneous emotional creativity, and also brilliant writers. And this is when, over the course of a few minutes, you're able to produce something great. It just comes to you as an emotional spurt, and then it's very, very defining. And it's not something that comes from deliberate effort per se. So it comes more from this emotional, perhaps intuitive place. And another important question here is, how much of this creativity that these brilliant individuals exhibited is due to intelligence and IQ, and how much of it is something else? So the relationship between intelligence and creativity has been subject to scientific research for decades. The most important notion linking intelligence and creativity is the threshold hypothesis, which presumes that above average intelligence is necessary for high levels of creativity. According to this hypothesis, there's a correlation between intelligence and creativity up to 120 IQ points. So between 0 and 120, the greater your IQ, the more creative you are. But above that, that association fades. And that brings up this question of creative potential and creative achievement. So creative potential, which is how people are actually able to have creative ideas, is IQ dependent up to that threshold. But creative achievement, interestingly, is not. Creative achievement refers to the actual realization of potential into real life accomplishments, like having made a scientific discovery or having written a novel. So it's basically taking what you're able to create and making it real, which is a very different process than creativity itself. Making something real is about execution, is about planning, is about being able to take the steps after creativity to actualize your vision. Let's talk a little bit about the neuroscience of creativity and psychopathology or madness. It used to be believed that creativity was a simple process that relied on the difference between the two hemispheres of the brain, the left brain and the right brain. The right brain was responsible for creativity, passion, sensuality, and being poetic, whereas the left brain was more responsible for language, logic, deliberate action, rationality. However, more recent literature has actually contradicted these findings and made them much more nuanced. Next slide. Now, in our understanding of creativity, there's actually 3 primary networks which rely on both sides of the brain to focus on different parts of the creativity process. The central executive network, otherwise known as the attention network, is responsible for targeted attention, concentration, and focus. As we all know, however, the human attention span can be incredibly short. So this network often switches rapidly with another network, the imagination network, otherwise known as the default mode network. The imagination network is integral to creative activities like brainstorming and daydreaming. It's also responsible for social cognition, being able to know what other people are feeling, for empathy, for even intuitive abilities. And finally, there's this network in between, the saliency network, that enables us to switch between one and the other. And this network is also very important in the creative process. It's the network that takes all of the stimuli, the external stimuli coming at us, as well as the internal stimuli, our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations, and filters out what we should pay attention to. What is the most salient of all of these? For creativity, it's been shown that it's actually good to reduce the activation of the attention network a little bit and to increase the activation of the imagination network and the saliency network. So this tells you a little bit about how creativity works in the brain, but not about how psychopathology and madness operates, which we're going to get to a little bit later. Next slide. So one more thing about that saliency network, the one that chooses, what do we focus on? Do we focus on our deliberate conscious attention that's coming in and the task at hand, or do we focus on the imagination daydreaming, the other brain circuits? So it's very interesting because there's actually a link between creativity and latent inhibition. The saliency network has a very important function in it called latent inhibition. And latent inhibition is this filtering mechanism to screen out irrelevant stimuli. And it's something that we share with other animals, and it's tied to the neurotransmitter dopamine. Research has consistently shown that low latent inhibition is associated with high creativity and originality. So when you have latent inhibition, you're able to screen out all those things that you're not focusing on at the time. So when you have a task at hand, if you're very good at focusing on the task at hand, you have high latent inhibition. You're able to screen out all the other stuff and focus on what you want to focus on. And yet there is people with ADHD or attention hyperactivity disorder. And those are people who they want to focus on a task at hand, but 10 other thoughts will come into their mind. So that is actually low latent inhibition. You can't filter that stuff out. With medication, often it will help you to be able to focus more. but it's probably latent inhibition that makes a person creative. And it's the other networks that generate just how creative they are. Because it's been shown that people and artists with low latent inhibition can concentrate on the relevant tasks at hand, but also on the irrelevant stimuli coming in, and then blend the two together in the creative process. And they actually become more creative by associating the two. And the most creative people are 7 times more likely to have reduced latent inhibition. And so, what are then the empirical findings between creativity and psychopathology? And so, also just going back to what I said in the last slide, another form, I guess, of psychopathology is ADHD, the inability to concentrate. But then we can also see how a facet of ADHD could actually be incredibly positive and constructive for creativity. So the empirical findings about madness or psychopathology and creativity are as follows. This is based on a number of researchers who've devoted their lives to combing the biographies of highly creative people, and also when people were alive, doing all sorts of tests on those people, like personality assessments and the like. So first, the rate and intensity of symptoms of mental illness was higher among prominent creative people than the general population. Highly creative artists were 2 times as likely to experience some psychiatric disorder relative to non-creatives. Depression was the most common, along with correlates of alcohol and suicide. On average, the more eminent the creator, the higher the expected rate and intensity of the mental illness. And the rate and intensity of symptoms of mental illness actually varied according to the domain. For example, 87% of famous poets experienced some form of psychopathology, compared to only 28% of eminent scientists. And the final finding was that the family lines, or the genetics, that produce the most prominent creators also tended to have a higher rate and intensity of mental illness. Going into a few of the illnesses, people with bipolar and first-degree relatives of people with bipolar are generally more creative. Bipolar people bipolar disease has afflicted many eminent creators, including Sexton, Vincent Van Gogh, Robert Schumann, and many others. Studies that assessed a small group of people who were incredibly creative. There was a very highly prestigious University of Iowa Writers' Workshop, and 30 participants there. When they looked across these participants, 43% of them met criteria for bipolar spectrum disorders, compared to 10% of your controls. And creativity is particularly likely among those with either mild form of bipolar or family histories of it, as opposed to full-blown bipolar. And that's the case actually with all mental illness. If it's severe, it keeps people from functioning. If it's enough to enable people to have brilliant minds and yet keep functioning, even with the disorder, that can enable people to reach great heights in their career, in their life, and in their professions. A little bit about substance use disorders, which certainly also fall into psychopathology. Many creatives, they prize drugs such as alcohol for their ability to make new creative insights, and excessive drinking has long been associated with the artistic personality. Studies on alcohol intoxication suggest positive benefits on the creative process to some degree, while excessive alcohol intake leads to problems. A study of 1,000 outstanding individuals who had their biographies published in the New York Times Book Review between 1960 and 1990 found a general increase in alcohol use in artists, and especially in writers. Alcohol use proved detrimental to productivity in over 75% of the sample, especially in the later phases of their drinking careers. So it's something, as many things, that in moderation can be incredibly helpful for the creative process, and in excess can have detrimental consequences. The final and perhaps most important question, what do you do with this information? How do you treat these brilliant creative individuals who have so much to give to society and so much to contribute, and often can, for many reasons, be very, apt not to seek treatment for their mental illness? And why wouldn't they seek treatment? There's reasons that other people would, also employs such as the stigma of being labeled mentally ill. Nobody wants that, the effect on one's reputation. But there's also other reasons for them in particular, and that's the fear that taking psychiatric medications or getting help of some sort would hinder their creativity. This idea also that one has to be a little mad to be creative, not wanting to be normal. It's interesting, it's having treated so many creatives. You can't imagine how many people have said to me, I don't want to be normal. I don't want to be like everybody else. I need to have a little bit of this, whatever this is, it's part of me. So you don't want to treat away who a person is. You don't want to treat away their soul. So it's enabling them to function and just making life a little bit easier for them. And sometimes also with mental illness comes illusions of invincibility and grandiosity. I'm not really sick. This is not really a problem. So in general, treatments for mental illness can be divided into ones that promote creativity and ones that kill creativity. So it's especially important when working with creative people to focus on the things that are going to promote creativity. And often there are, some medications that promote creativity, like a medication called Wellbutrin, and others that can dull it, like medications like lithium and others that many people have described as creativity killing. And there's also a lot of non-pharmacologic approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, creative writing, drama music therapy, which can reduce patient suffering and may yield better outcomes than not treating someone if they refuse any kind of pharmacology. So in conclusion, mental illness and creativity are very closely related, sharing many traits and antecedents. However, severe mental illness is negatively associated with creativity. Therefore, persons with full-blown schizophrenia or alcohol dependence may not be creative, but only milder forms of all illnesses may be conducive to creativity. IQ only determines creative potential, but not creative achievement. And it's very important, yet particularly challenging, to treat mental illness in creatives. And treatment must focus on ways to enhance and sustain their creative potential over their lifespan. Thank you very much. So I open it up now to you for your questions. Alberto, can you unmute yourself, or can I unmute Alberto?
I can unmute.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Hi, great talk, by the way. So I just have a question about your thoughts on that possibly creative doesn't necessarily have to be have a mental situation. It could just be in itself that, why do that both sort of need to be wrapped in that? That whole concept is sort of a kind of an old Van Gogh concept. Well, you got to be a little bit, way out there to be this creative. And that's sort of an old sort of thing that's been established, and has been carried as a norm. And isn't that in itself sort of perpetuating people thinking, well, I'm an artist, so therefore I should be a little bit crazy. Do you think that plays part of that into it? And that I think there's sort of two separate things. And granted, there's some people that definitely have that overlapping where the insanity does, but do you think that some of that old myth has perpetuated into that people think now that to be an artist, they need to be a little bit out there?
It's interesting. It's a very interesting question, right? Because that myth, like you said, can perpetuate, the very problem and lead to the stigma of not getting treatment and of this. And also, I thought the statistic related to your question that was very telling in the presentation was that in artists, people who had composers and artists, there was a much higher percentage of people who were diagnosed with some sort of disorder, as opposed to in scientists, where actually much, much less were diagnosed. And by no means, in order to be creative, do you need to have any sort of psychopathology. But it's interesting about the overlapping brain regions, and that there is certain kinds of antecedents that could dictate both the creative process as well as propensity to mental illness if untreated. I think I also have a lot of artists in my own practice who are deeply creative and amazing and have treated mental conditions without it inhibiting their creative potential. And I also have a lot of artists in my practice who don't have psychopathology, who are brilliant and amazing and are struggling to go through life and are seeing a psychiatrist in order to deal with their life issues without actually ever meeting criteria for any sort of diagnosis. So I think a lot of the research is because that connection, it exists even prior to us saying it. It's kind of a priori thing. And people have asked the question, is there that connection? And found the answer, indeed there is. But by no means does that have to be there. And hopefully we could, as we move on in terms of the different treatments that are available, especially non-pharmacologic treatments, make it possible for more and more people to, if they have propensities or vulnerabilities to mental illness, to not develop that and to channel that energy in positive, constructive ways to enhance their creative potential.
Thank you. Cool.
A couple of questions have come in from the chat. So Steve Whitmer, hi Steve, has said, how do you feel about the idea of objectifying one's mental state in order to use it creatively rather than live it? Steve, would you like to expand more on that?
I don't know whether you can hear me. I'm having trouble with my video, but no, there seems to be a place in performance where if you begin to objectify those issues, you can then step away from them and not necessarily be experiencing them yourself, except to use them to do more things. Once you're not living it, you can kind of use it as a tool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is actually what Tchaikovsky said, that his doctor, when he was having his bouts of mental illness, his doctor said to him, please take some time off and rest. And he's like, no, I don't need to rest. What I need to do is to create more. His capacity to be able to channel that energy into constructive, productivity was what enabled him to live. And I think what you're saying about objectifying an emotional state is being able not to be defined by that state, not to become your depression or your mania, but to be able to see that as a part of you, but not you, and saying, here is my mania, and I can watch this and I could feel the feelings, but I don't have to become that. And I can use what I learned in watching this to actually inform my art, my music, my creativity, and all facets of my identity and my being. So 100%, yes.
I appreciate you addressing that. Thank you.
Excellent. I have a question from Karina Blue Rose. Thank you, Karina. They say, do you think the expectation or pressure of conformity in determining normal has yet led to the ubiquitous practice of pathologizing of creative personalities? So I guess it's like
right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what is normal anyways, right? And we create normal just based on like looking around and saying, what does 95% of society do, right? And so we have this expectation of normal, but a lot of people, especially the most creative, who are able to do amazing things, are not normal. Like we talked about in the presentation about Mozart, how he would, when he was dissatisfied or bored with something, would jump over a few chairs in public, start meowing like a cat, and express his disregard for something in that way. That's certainly outside of normal. And yet this was a brilliant, amazing man. And I think society, unfortunately, has constrained, limited, and narrow conceptions of normality, which on one hand we need in order to understand and to be able to, create the categories that we have. And yet you can live a beautiful life being outside of those categories if you find a way to enable yourself and your propensity and your symptoms to work for you. So there are many people who go through their ups and downs of bipolar, for instance, and are able to use the depression to inform themselves. The depression informs of what's possible in life, and what's possible not just at the heights of life, but also at the most sometimes inspiring times. The lows are often what gives people insight into the depths of humanity, but then to use the highs to actually produce and create. So thank you for that question.
We've got about 3 minutes left, so one last question.
And I see also, can we do a few more? Because I see Charles Johnson is also raising his hand.
Oh, yes. Okay, cool. Wonderful. Should we speak to Charles first? Charles, would you like to unmute yourself? Or if...
okay, there. Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Well, as you know, lithium is quite important for some people who are suffering with bipolar disease. And some authors have been prescribed lithium. Is there a better alternative for creativity?
Well, and this is the thing. So I made the statement that Wellbutrin promotes creativity, lithium can dull creativity. That is maybe for the majority of people. I have a number of patients who are writers and creatives on lithium for whom it does not do that. by no means is that the end all be all. Everybody responds quite differently. And there are also the nature of people's creativity is different. I've had people on Wellbutrin, which is supposed to be more the creativity enhancing medication, who's dulled creativity for certain people. And then also, other medications, for instance, like attention medications for ADHD, like Adderall and Ritalin. Those medications are supposed to dull your creativity because it enables you to focus on the task at hand. And as opposed to on all the other things coming into your mind. People with ADHD often are a little bit more creative than the general population. And so you give them attention medication so they can focus more. But I have some ADHD people that are so creative, have so many things going on. The only way that they could actually take their creativity and make it into something real and actual is on these medications. So I think that the most important thing is to find what works for you, and what, if you are on a medication, to find the medication that works with your creative process. For bipolar, there's a lot of things. At the time of Ernest Hemingway, there really wasn't very many things for him. And he used, ECT for his depression. He used alcohol. A lot of people way back would use alcohol actually to treat and self-medicate certain symptoms, including either the mania or the depression or anxiety. So now the pharmacology is much more advanced. And for many people, medications have been able, like an example is Andrew Solomon. He's in my profession, a brilliant, amazing writer who's won numerous awards for his writing, and he suffers from severe depression and has for many years of his life. And he's written about the different medications that he's been on and its effect on his treatment. Medications, he says, have saved not just his life, but his ability to remain creative throughout his life and to contribute as much as he has. So I think it's important not to make generalizations, but really to work with your doctor and make sure you find the right thing for yourself that enables you to sustain potential, your creative potential.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant, thank you. Lots of comments in the chat. This has been a really engaging presentation. Just one last comment / question before we tie up. So from Karen N, I hope I pronounced that correctly. They say, would encouraging creativity be a good way to reduce symptoms of mental illness? In other words, would it be a healthy distraction? I understand that mental illness and creativity go hand in hand, but perhaps people with mental illness intrinsically know that they need to keep their mind occupied, and that's why more people are creative. Creativity may be a natural result of humans trying to calm their minds from noise. Excellent insight, Karen. Thank you.
Yes, 100%. I completely agree. And I think that for so many people, I have so many brilliant patients in my practice with very, very active minds. And part of what is most difficult for them to live the life they want is to be able to quiet the noise in the mind. And why is it important to quiet that noise? Because that noise, it could drive us crazy, but it's when you quiet that noise, you also can have insight into your soul and into the depths of who you really are, your intuition. You can hear that still quiet voice that can only be heard when the chatter of our emotional and rational mind temporarily, exactly, monkey mind, somebody wrote, exactly, temporarily ceases. So absolutely, creative activities are a wonderful way to channel your energy in order to be able to actually get in touch more with your intuition and have more peace of mind and calm.